And I am very excited for all my friends to meet one of my longest standing friends. And Bill was our real estate agent at one point in Israel, and I was crawling over.
Okay,
All
Barbara,
right, crawling over all sorts of unfinished buildings. But
so are you guys seeing the
yes.
yeah, okay, so let me get back here. That's not okay.
But I was
All right,
crawling over all sorts of unfinished buildings, and
Yeah.
Bill took David and me home to his apartment where I met his wonderful artist wife, Lisa. And the apartment, I don't know how long you'd been collecting, but it was basically the beginnings of a collection compared to what it's become. And I used to play the game whenever I was up there. If I could have anything out of those vitrines, what would I take? And I have watched.
So Barbara, you're responsible for those missing objects?
I was going to get to that later.
I'm calling Interpol.
Barbara is one of the few collectors that I have learned a lot from. She always told me that the only stolen object she would buy is directly in her field. She wouldn't go outside of it. So we're in good shape.
Now you're
so are you seeing anything now?
Yes.
Yes. So if you will begin, sir.
Yeah, resume slideshow. Great. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my collection today, but not in the normal way. I'm not going to present to you a treasures of presentation, which I detest. I've been collecting now for almost 60 years. So I feel that I passed that level of collecting a long time ago and have really been since I was 52 years old when I basically left business and began to devote myself entirely to the collection and working with it, trying to figure out what the hell is the meaning of it. Collecting objects is something that anybody can do. In the world today, if one is a serious collector in a serious field, of course, it's for better or for worse, an expensive way to spend time, but certainly a very satisfying one. And so I began to understand very early on that my approach to these things was seeing them not as art objects, which I almost did not see them as from the beginning, but rather as documents of Jewish history, in the same way that a scholar would go to an archive and leaf through folders and find evidence of something on a printed sheet or a written letter. My approach toward these objects was very, very much the same. And so what I want to try to share with you today is how this approach developed and what it meant to me. And in order to do that, you have to understand that the Jewish world today is nothing like it was 200 years ago. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Of course, the main one being the Holocaust, which affected everything culturally, population, economics. There's nothing that it didn't have a revolutionary and sad effect upon. So I collect objects most of the time that are 18th and 19th century. 17th century Judaica is almost non-existent. 20th century, there's relatively few things that I think are terribly significant and make a major contribution to the cultural aspect of it. So Um, we're going to see a lot of images, and we're going to talk a bit about them. And this is an image which of the Temple Mount, in Hebrew, Beit HaMikdash. It's here in Jerusalem. For those of you who have been here, you of course visited the Western Wall, or what used to be called the Wailing Wall, which is one of the supporting walls for the mound on which the temple was built during Herod's time 2,000 years ago. And it's an interesting image. Obviously, at that time, it was a Jewish building. And so we find that same image that we just saw, which we'll get back to in a minute, in a Jewish book from 1695, the prayer book, which is for the Seder, the first evening of the Passover holiday. And it's very interesting because it's at the end where they're talking about, may Jerusalem be rebuilt in our time. And this is from 1695. It was an extremely important book because it was the first Haggadah, of which there have been more than 6,000 editions since it was first published at the beginning of the 16th century. In which they used copper engravings rather than wood blocks. And that made it much easier. Obviously, the quality of the illustrations was infinitely better. But when somebody did that, they clearly had to have a source for what they did. They didn't work out of their imagination. And so we can find the source very, very easily. It's almost a literal interpretation. And this book is something called Icones Biblicae by Matthias Marian, who published it in Frankfurt am Main between 1625 and 1630. He made hundreds and hundreds of magnificent copper etchings, which became the basis of, I would say, the majority of illustrated Bibles from that time on, certainly the Protestant ones. So it is interesting that the engraver of the Amsterdam Haggadah in 1695 would go back and use this image. He obviously was using a Bible that had these images in. I have one such Bible from 1650 from London. And he happened to have been a convert to Judaism from Christianity. And so when he copied these, he really was quite liberal and literal. And on top of the Temple Mount in the Jewish book of the Haggadah, there's still a cross on top of the temple building. Now, this is really something which in Jewish life seems unbelievable. And it's most interesting that at that time, nobody seemed to have noticed it. There's nothing written about it. There's nothing that is a remembrance of it. When they did a second edition in 1712, it disappeared. So somebody obviously must have done it. But at that time, in one of the first representations that we have of the temple on the Temple Mount, it ends up with a cross on it. And this particular image was continued for years and years in many different sorts of ways, even moving into other Passover prayer books, as you see on the left here from Offenbach at the end of the 18th century. And that was taken and put on a silver cup for the blessing of the wine for holidays and the Sabbath. And there's another drawing from that book, which you can see on the right-hand side, which was also put into the metal. So the question of images is really interesting for me. And what has always been a major theme of mine is trying to understand, where do these things come from? Because we have in Jewish life many ritual objects as opposed to, let's say, Catholicism or Christian faith in general, or Islam. We have many, many religious ceremonies that take place in the home. And for those, there are many, many objects, as well as being many objects in the synagogue. Now, if you go into a Catholic church or cathedral almost anywhere in the world, you're going to see basically the same Gothic design of church silver everywhere you go. And that is a definite Christian style of ritual objects. Jews lived in 128 different countries. And while, as I said, there's a Jewish form, there is no such thing as Jewish style. And therefore, they had to turn to sources in order to make some kind of stylistic statement as to what they did. So we have, for instance, this is a ketubah, a Jewish wedding certificate. We have the ketubah, or Jewish wedding certificate, is a document that goes back 2,000 years. We have hints of it from the caves of Qumran, which is more than 2,000 years ago. And it's basically the first feminist document because it's written in order to protect the rights of the wife in a marriage contract. Either if the person dies, it guarantees her a certain sum of money for her maintenance, or if they get divorced, she also must get a payment if that happens. And so it's a document which is present at every Jewish wedding, has been, and we find very often that in certain parts of the world, they're decorated. And this one is really interesting because in addition to everything else, it's got an image of a Brahmin bull. Now, a Brahmin bull has no particular relationship to a Jewish wedding, most certainly, but it is something which this scribe or Jewish artist saw every day, and he simply integrated it into his creation. If we look at the type of wedding contracts from Iran, we find a huge variety of them. This is one from Tehran, as you see, and on the right is a Muslim sale contract from Tehran from the 19th century. And it turns out that in Persia, they very, very often decorated all sorts of documents, not just wedding documents. And clearly, the Jewish scribes, again, took from what they saw in the society and did it. So here we have a book type ketubah. It's a different shape and smaller. Those others are large documents. And we find a Muslim wedding contract, which is basically the same. And these same Islamic kind of decorative motifs carried over into Jewish manuscripts as well. And here we have a couple of 18th century ones. And the one on the right is particularly interesting because it is clearly of Quranic origin. And doing research, I discovered that writing the Quran was such a relatively normal activity that one could go to the markets at this time and get pre-decorated pages where you would have the cover very well illustrated, and the other covers all have a gold leaf frame in which they would then write the rest of it and perhaps decorate some more. In the left is another wedding contract, one of the earliest ones that we know of. And of course, it resembles what one can certainly take away as a Persian rug. And clearly that was a source for this. Or one from Gibraltar from 1832. Now, the Jewish community in Gibraltar was founded in the 18th century by Jews from Morocco. And therefore, the text and the writing that you see in the middle here is directly to that. But they were influenced by the European style of the British control of the place. And what did they present it as? A stage and a theater. And if we think in all our religions, what is a wedding if not a form of theater? It's really very, very suitable. And we can go into Italy, where perhaps the most beautiful wedding contracts were done. And this one is very interesting. It happens to be an 18th century one in which the text was scraped off the parchment because this was done on parchment, and another wedding was recorded with it in the 19th century. But it's this image that I want to concentrate on because you have here the wedding couple standing outside their bedroom, preparing to go into the bedroom with a wedding night, was showing the bed inside, which is just not typical in Jewish life. Modesty, as we'll talk a little bit later, was a major concern. And so how do these things happen? What happens to an image from the time that it's created, and how does it go through different phases? And we're going to talk about one, which is Moses before the burning bush. And the first image that we find of the style that continued was from Holbein, was a wood block done in Lyon in 1538. And then our friend Matthias Marion, who we're going to come back to regularly, copied it in his own way in his early 17th century things. It traveled, and then it was used in Jewish Amsterdam in a number of different title pages at the beginning of the 18th century, and eventually found its way to a book called Se'ena Ura'ena, which is a book of biblical stories in Yiddish for Jewish women. Jewish women did not generally know Hebrew, and they did know Yiddish. And so these books, which were for women, children also, to keep them entertained with many, many, many different illustrations. Here we have the same illustration taken in. And then with a Haggadah, which we'll come back to again also, from 1816 from Basel, we have the same image. And eventually we have it in Bombay in another Haggadah Passover prayer book printed in 1846 in Bombay. So we can watch the progression, and I could give a much more detailed explanation of that progression from the early 16th century in Lyon up into Bombay in 1846, and it's still used in modern Haggadah reproductions as well. And now we'll go to another Jewish festival, Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights. And I'm sure most of you have probably seen a Hanukkah lamp, which has 8 different places for wicks or candles to celebrate the 8 days of the miracle, which was oil for one day after the Greeks were pushed out of the Holy Land in the Hasmonean period. And it has been celebrated ever since. And it's interesting to see how that becomes an architectural metaphor in many ways. So we look at one from Fez from 1930, and we see this very elaborate back. This is all silver work. And if we take a look, we can see the kind of carved wood and carved plaster designs that you can see in almost every public building and mosque this happens to be from Morocco, that again, the artist used as his source of inspiration. Or we go to Italy, where we see several different examples. And it's really quite extraordinary, because if we look here and then we look down here, we see exactly that kind of arrangement with the very large blocks here. And clearly that's the source of what this caster was using in the design of this Hanukkah lamp that he made with the 8 burners down below. And here's one from the 19th century Rome, and it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to see what's going on here. This is a building in Rome. It has exactly the same rounded thing with the columns, different columns, but columns, even to using the oculus up here in a slightly different way on this object. And we find the same thing in Eastern Europe. This is what's called a synagogue Hanukkah lamp, because it has the aspects of many of the wooden synagogues that were made in Eastern Europe. You can see here like two doors, which undoubtedly, and the pillars that represent the interior of the synagogue, and the ark where the Torah scrolls are kept. And then if you look at the outside and you look here, you see this kind of dormer window, which obviously the caster was familiar with and which he saw. And this is something called Ukrainian provincial architecture in wood. Mainly churches still remain. Not a single wooden synagogue remains out of the hundreds that were in existence between the First and Second World Wars. They were all completely destroyed. And you look at the one on the right, and I'm sure you've all been in Amsterdam. And when you walk the canals, you don't have to look far to see the inspiration for this lamp, which you can see on both sides of every canal for kilometers on end when you walk the city. This is a particularly interesting one. It's something done in Prague in 1872. And you have to understand this particular period, the second half of the 19th century, was a period of incredible enrichment in Europe. Both cities, states, and individuals became very wealthy. Of course, it's part of the industrial age, and the people who merchants and industrialists and the cities made tremendous amounts of money. And so we see in this theater, as you have here with a curtain, and here you see the elements of the curtain above. But why do we have a peacock of all things? Well, it turns out that every town of any reasonable size by the end of the 19th century had created a theater, and every theater needed a curtain. And one of the major decorations for curtains during this period was a peacock, a colored peacock. And if you can imagine a theater curtain going up and the peacock disappearing, and then at the end or the intermission it coming down, and this peacock coming together from the two sides. And we do have a remnant of it in Tivoli in Copenhagen. And you can see exactly the same thing with a three-dimensional peacock that you see right here, as you saw on the Hanukkah lamp as well. And that's exactly what they were presenting in this theater type Hanukkah lamp. It also comes in wonderful other objects. I mean, you take a look at this Hanukkah lamp, and what is it patterned after? If you were in 1840 in Vienna, and you were to walk into any bourgeoisie house, you would find in the living room a Biedermeier couch. And this is what it looked like, and this is what the artisan was copying for his Jewish client in making a lamp. In Frankfurt am Main, the beginning of the 18th century, and here we have a kind of chest-like structure for the lamp. And if we look, we see, yeah, that's what they had at that time. That was a very vital piece of furniture in German homes. And so again, the artist was simply relating to his environment. He didn't give these things any religious meaning or take a religious symbol that he thought had meaning. It was simply stylistic, and he related to his environment. The same thing happens with other objects in the cultural influence. This is another Hanukkah lamp, and a most interesting one, because as you can see in the, excuse me. You can see in this picture drums and bayonets and cannon and flags and all trumpets and all sorts of warlike devices. And one could say, because Hanukkah is a celebration of a military victory over the Greeks, that's very, very proper. But as it happens, until the beginning of the 20th century and the Zionist movement, the creation of a movement for the reestablishment of a Jewish homeland, they emphasized the militaristic characteristic of Hanukkah. And so this is a Hanukkah lamp from the 18th century. And it also has a source which was in a grenadier's helmet. And this particular one, if you look at the ligature down here of the FR, Fredericus Rex from Prussia. And you can see the same thing up here, but this is the kind of metal. There's a long story behind this as to how these, we know of about 15 such lamps in different museum collections across the world, both from Fredericus Rex and from Maria Theresa in the Habsburg Empire. And it's just an interesting adaptation. It's a piece of brass which can be highly polished, so it gives a wonderful reflector, which is the idea of lights being lit and the light being reflected out for people. And it's a secondary use, but a very, very interesting one that's very proper for what we see. We find the same thing. There is a ceremony at the end of the Sabbath, which is called Havdalah. And one of the acts is the smelling of sweet spices to keep the sweetness of the Sabbath as you move into the profane week from the holiness of the Sabbath. And this particular form that you see on the left is one that we always knew came from Eastern Europe. I always felt that it came from the Ukraine, but we really didn't know what it was. And I have traveled fairly extensively in the Ukraine, never found a building that particularly looked like this until I got to Lviv on my second trip there. And as I came in, I saw this building, which is a building as early 17th century monastery tower. And if you look abstractly and you see the levels and the shapes here, the hexagonal shape, which is here, and then it goes up to another one, and then you have it's an exact representation. And it further turned out, a friend of mine in Lviv took me to the city museum where there was a replica of the Rathaus, the municipal building from the 18th century, which is almost exactly as you see this spice tower. And it collapsed in 1828. Both of these buildings, that and this monastery building, were created by an Italian architect who worked in the Ukraine at the beginning of the 17th century, who had a most interesting name, Bemer the Slow. Why he had this name, I haven't yet been able to find out. But this traditional form was adapted from him, and there are hundreds of these across the world in different private and public collections. Another place is a town called Schwäbisch Gmünd, which is about 50 kilometers from Stuttgart. And we find here again the type of lamp which was done from here. And we see the famous towers of the wall around Schwäbisch Gmünd. And we don't have to look far to see where this artisan was looking and what he was copying when he made his creation. And we go back to a ketubah for a moment, because the one on the left from Meknes in Morocco, which happens to be one of the favorites in my collection, I just love the riot of color and design, which is so typical of so many, many things Moroccan. There was no need of this incredible symmetry that we think about in Western art as something very, very necessary. And when I first came to Meknes the first time, it was the beginning of the 90s, and I walked into the main square and I looked over to the gate to the Kasbah, and there it was. There was the inspiration. And this became the typical design for these wedding certificates or contracts in Meknes. They all use this general design, which is a wonderful one. Here's one from Istanbul, from the Camondo family. I don't know how many of you have ever visited the Camondo Museum in Paris. It's a museum of the 18th century decorative French arts, quite an incredible place. And the Camondo family had their origins in the Ottoman Empire. They were known as the Rothschilds of the Ottoman Empire. They were incredibly rich bankers. At one point in the 50s of the 19th century, they had a major fallout with a sultan, and they liquidated everything and moved to Paris. Just as an interesting adjunct, they became the major supporters of the Impressionist movement. And no small part of the major collections in the Petit Palais and in the Louvre are donations from the Camondo family. And at one time, they commissioned from a number of different Impressionist artists graphics, and they bought sets of them, divided them up, and donated them to the regional museums in France. So they would also have something of Impressionist art. So they were a very prominent family. This document that you're looking at here is almost 5 feet high. It's huge. It's the largest wedding contract that I know. And it's done in gold leaf with beautiful decoration. But there's one very odd thing about it. And that is at the bottom are these houses on stilts. And you have to ask yourself again, what possible connection does this have to a Jewish wedding? Well, it doesn't have any, but it has a very great connection to the Camondo family, because all the great aristocratic and wealthy families in Istanbul had vacation homes on the Golden Horn, and they were all on the waterfront, and many of them held up by stilts or by poles at the waterfront edge. And so in essence, what you had was this family making a social statement as to who they were in the decoration of this wedding document, that they were part of the elite of Istanbul, which they most certainly were. These are what are called rimonim. You know that the Torah scroll is kept on 2 wooden staves so that it can be rolled back and forth. And the top of those staves have poles, and on those poles are set decorative elements, and they're called rimonim. Means pomegranates, and the original shape of them were round, but in many cases they began to resemble towers. And here we see from 2 places, even though they're close together, we see exactly the same tower. And we find that it is a direct copy of the Rathaus, the municipal building of Emden. And it's almost a 1-to-1 picture, as you see. One of the most exciting things for me is to find the exact source of imagery among the things that I have in the collection. More in Hanukkah lamps, we find something extremely interesting in the East, or North Africa or the Far East. And if we look here, we see in 3 places, in essence, this is a very stylized version of the Star and Crescent, the quintessential Islamic symbol, the crescent and often star that you see on top of every mosque in the world. And we'll see one shortly. So this is in Algeria. And if you go to Baghdad, you find the same kind of thing. You find this same stylized crescent and star. Now, obviously, this is a kind of, and it's like the national symbol on the flag of the Ottoman Empire or Turkey today. So it had religious overtones, but these people, artisans, casters, brass workers, certainly did not put it on there for that reason. They simply did it because it was attractive, and it was a part of the atmosphere in which they lived and they saw all the time. And we can see the same thing here in a beautiful one, another one from Algeria, where it's even the centerpiece of this particular piece. And in the Hanukkah lamp on the right, the entire lamp is this Muslim symbol. And it's really incredible, because in all of these things, nobody today would ever even dare to think about decorating a Jewish object with a star and crescent. It's simply unthinkable. And yet we find it in Algeria and North Africa. We find it in Iraq. We find it all over the Ottoman Empire, and not so long ago. So something has happened. Another image which we often see is this particular presentation of Moses with the tablets of the law. And we find it in a number of different places. This is a micrographic print. Micrography, by the way, is the only Jewish contribution to the history of art in terms of technique. Micrography is the rendition of images or decoration using script, using line script. In Christian manuscripts, we have some where they have figures which are filled with script, but this is another unique thing where all of these details that you see are texts of Jewish documents. And we have the same thing in something printed in the United States about 1875, a beautiful chromolithograph, probably from Breslau in Germany, some 120 years ago. That somehow got to North Africa where it was copied and a bit orientalized and printed again there. Again, printed in a New Year's card for the Jewish New Year in Germany. And all of these, of course, have a source. And that source is a portrait of Moses by Philippe de Champagne in France in 1648. This is a copy from the Hermitage, but there are 3 copies of this in different museums in the world. And it was taken from there, a Jewish figure, obviously, and transferred into Jewish use in visual nature in things that were printed. I want to go back to the idea of symbols again, and we want to take a look. Remember, we talked about the crescent being on top of the mosque, and this is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which I assume probably all of you have seen at one time or another. Incredible building from the 7th century. It's amazing when you think of this building remaining as it was for all those years, and it is magnificent. But I want to look at something different because we find it, again, on Jewish objects. This happens to be a print done in Algeria, a stone lithograph done in Algeria with like a travel log of the Jewish holy places in the Holy Land. And in a detail here, you see you see this wonderful rendition of that building, and it's labeled Beit HaMikdash. It's labeled the temple, the temple. And it was a Islamic religious structure. And here it is represented as a temple. And over hundreds of years, this became the representation among Jews for the Temple Mount. This quintessential Islamic building, one of the 3 main sites for Islamic pilgrimage, became the representation for religious Jews all over the world. And this also has a source. And we go back and we find that in Crusader maps of the 13th century, when they would show this and however they showed it, and it was Templum Salomonis, they were showing that building as the time. Or one of the most important books of the early printing, the Nuremberg Chronicles, again, we see the building rendered and Templum Salomonis, and the Jews continued that tradition. We have a 15th century manuscript from Italy, and avodah, which means the temple work. Obviously, they were relating that this is the temple because you see the sacrifices taking place on both sides of it. And it became in use all over. It became a symbol of printing. In here you have 2 from Venice from the 16th century, from Prague from the 16th and 17th century, from 18th century Istanbul. It repeats itself over and over and over as the representation of the holiest place in Jerusalem for Jews. It's really quite exceptional. This is a document that shows it again. And it says, again, the temple. Now, later it began to be put in as the place of the temple, which is a better explanation, also in Algeria, also in Persia. And this is a wonderful carved bookbinding. It was commissioned by a Jewish printer originally from Poland in 1883. And inside is a book that he published, and he sent the whole thing to his brother in Warsaw. Or a painting on glass where here again it says the place of the temple. But this continued all the way up into the 20s, the 1920s, where it in England and in Jerusalem, it was reproduced as Jerusalem, the representative of Jerusalem. And this went on for hundreds and hundreds of years. And today it's really ironic that this Muslim building would have been chosen to represent the holiest places. So we find on other things, like a beautiful silver bookbinding from my collection. And I found in Prague, among the Torah curtains there, a 18th century piece of fabric, probably from Italy, which obviously was copied in silver on this particular bookbinding. Here we have another pair of rimonim, again, the things that go on the staves of the Torah scroll. They're gold-plated, gold leaf on silver from Cochin. And what is it? It's not so much, it's anything. It is a representation at the top of the lotus flower. So here, this artisan, again, took his inspiration from something basically Hindu and put it in, along with a Jewish form, with a style that was popular in the surroundings. Here's a Torah shield, which is another Torah decoration. Clearly the inspiration was this rural Greece belt buckle. A woman's prayer book with beautiful embroidered under glass pictures. But if you look, this is clearly a synagogue inside. And when you come over to this side and you look, you see the chalice and the beads, which you might have found on any Christian woman's religious book at the very, very same time. And it was perfectly acceptable. Now I do want to talk a bit about modesty, which I mentioned at the beginning. And you have to understand that today, among ultra-Orthodox Jews who represent, at least according to them, the epitome of Jewish religious worship, the ultimate female value is modesty. And if for any of you who have ever seen ultra-Orthodox women completely covered, stockings, long sleeves, even those in some places in Israel where they dress like the Taliban insist that women dress in Afghanistan. And this is all in the name of the value of what they call sniut, modesty. I guess it's very typical of fundamentalist religions, and the ultra-Orthodox certainly are that. And we find that a few hundred years ago, things were a bit different. Now, obviously, this is not modesty. It's a bare-breasted woman, and she appears on a book of Jewish law from 1709. Now, it's very important that you understand, in 18th century Frankfurt, at the beginning of the century, there was no such thing as a liberal Jew, a Reformed Jew, a conservative Jew. If a Jew wasn't religious, he was no longer Jewish. Pure and simple, black and white. Now, obviously, a book of Jewish law was only used by religious Jews for study, and yet he studied, and every time he opened it, he was faced with these pictures of bare-breasted women. Another one, the same thing. This one isn't just a book of Jewish law. This is a book of responsa, where people would write to famous rabbis with conundrums, with questions, and they would answer what was the lawful decision to do in answer to these questions. And then they were often published. So this was only by the most observant people who really wanted to know the minutiae of the religion. And we have the same thing. And it was only studied by such people. Now, here we have censorship. And it's a very interesting aspect of censorship. Clearly, there was something there that whoever it was had this book didn't want revealed. And sure enough, it is a picture in a book of fables printed in 1546 in Italy. And if in early 17th to 18th century Frankfurt, there were no such thing as a liberal Jewish person, most certainly in 16th century Venice, there weren't. And yet here we have this book of fables with such an image, which is censored. But either the man did not read the rest of the book, or he felt he'd done his duty with what he did. And as you can see, by the way, this is a censor's signature for the church if he was found anything that he didn't like in the book. Because later in the book, we have a different picture, a different of the same couple. And if you look at it here, my God, there's no mistaking. She's looking down and pointing up, and he's pointing down and looking up. And there's simply no doubt this was a book that was read by religious, observant Jews in Italy in the 18th century. And apparently it was a very, very popular book, maybe because of that. I don't know. This is a book of a famous sermon by a Prague rabbi. And again, on the frontispiece is Adam and Eve, but Eve is in her most natural state. Or another book, a book of Jewish law, where there's all sorts of wonderful figures of Aaron and Moses and Puti up above, which were typical of that time, but also down below, again, bare-breasted angels, as it were. And this was used by these same people. And there's simply no writing, and Jews wrote about everything in the world. There's nothing that they did not write about. And here we have one that you see on the left. It's a prayer book. It was only used in the synagogue. And yet you have the same image down below. On the right, we go back to this same book that I spoke about before with Yiddish biblical stories for women. Again, Adam and Eve are presented. And of course, where was it taken from? From our good friend Matthias Marian from Frankfurt earlier. And the same thing was with the image of Lot and his daughters, where we have the same kind of thing. And these books at San Moreno were produced in 50 to 100 different editions, and they all had these kinds of images in them. So we now go to another Jewish celebration of Purim, of the saving of the Jews of Persia. I'm sure you guys have probably heard there's this thing that whenever how do you celebrate a Jewish holiday? You say they tried to kill us, they didn't succeed, let's eat. So this is the kind of thing that we have there as well. And we have a picture on the right, which is from a legend about Purim, where the king's wife refused to parade naked before him, and she was therefore executed, but again, with her bosom exposed. And this is the wife of the villain in the story. And she also has, and all the women who are presented, and there are quite a few from the story on the top of this scroll, are presented in the same way. And of course, this is nothing out of the ordinary, because in the middle of the 18th century in Venice, this is almost how women dressed. Their breasts were pushed up and out of their dresses, and it was a fashion of the period. And this artist was simply copying what was going on in his city at this particular time. Another scroll, a wonderful one. We see here an image which you can see represents this legend of the king having requested from his queen to parade naked before a major dinner that he had for friends and guests. And you can see on the right. And where did he take that from? From the muses. It's a picture of muses. And so these people were able to grab from many different places and present these things in Jewish objects. Another one on another scroll from the Ukraine. And again, we have two pictures of two people embracing. This one in that you could see, I don't know whether he was trying to present about what he thought men were like, or if this is a monster from a legend in some other place. It's hard to tell, but it's certainly clear that this was taken by its owner to the synagogue for the reading of the scroll and of the story. And this was there for him to see and who was ever around him to see at the same time. And Jews were only religious. We have another festival called Simchat Torah, which celebrates the end of one cycle of the Torah scroll and the beginning of the next cycle, the end and the beginning. And it's a major festival with great happiness. And not only are the scrolls all taken out of the ark and carried around and danced around the synagogue, but children are also participating, and they were given flags. And look at this flag for children, done in Warsaw in 1862. It's a biblical story about revenge by two brothers on a particular city. But my goodness, this was carried by children in a religious ceremony. So we've looked up until now at images that mostly have to do with the Old Testament, which is something that Jews were familiar with. But we can find things that are even stranger. So we get an image, which of course you'll all recognize. Almost nobody wouldn't recognize it, of the Last Supper. And of course, the Last Supper was a Passover ceremony. So the fact that it takes place in a Haggadah, in a prayer book for the beginning of the Passover holiday, shouldn't be so surprising. It's from Basel, 1816, and the image itself is copied from a Protestant Bible that was printed in Basel in the 18th century. But there it is, a totally New Testament Christian image used in a Jewish book. Now, it's really amazing, but as far as I can tell in terms of writing, I was either the or one of the first people to point this out to people. Now, you have to understand that many of these things are examined and used by religious people, and not all of them have an artistic background, and it may not have been recognized. But to have something which is, of course, from a church in a Jewish book is unusual. Any of you recognize this image?
Yeah. Joseph and Mary.
Yeah, exactly. It's Joseph and Mary with the Christ child going down to Egypt. And it doesn't appear in the Old Testament for sure. So again, where does it come from? It comes from our old friend, Marion, who put this image in his iconic image library. And it is used to illustrate in a small miniature Jewish manuscript, the Traveler's Prayer. Now, these little miniature books are 3-4 inches tall maximum. They were made by wealthy merchants for their wives or mistresses. I don't know. They are hundreds of them, and they themselves are a copy of a Christian custom of the same time of wealthy Christian merchants and aristocracy who had miniature illuminated books made for their spouses or their mates. And so we find the same thing in Jewish life. Now, did the artist know what he was copying, or did he blindly copy it? I can't say, but my guess is he found it in a Christian book, and therefore he knew it was a Christian image. Did the woman who got it know that it was a Christian image from the New Testament? It's hard to say. And the truth is that these two examples, which I brought to you now, are really the only ones that I could bring you, at least from things that I know. But this basically sums up everything that I wanted to try to get across. That the interesting thing is that all of this, excuse me, all of these appearances that I've been showing to you are basically from the 17th and the 18th and the 19th centuries. And this was a period when the liberal Jewish idea only began to develop at the end of the 19th century and through the end of the 18th century and through the 19th century into the 20th. Now, one would imagine that with that development of a liberal Jewish approach, there would be an opening of one's eyes, of one's horizons, to include many different kinds of images. And it's exactly the opposite that has taken place. And among the real Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities, virtually none of the things that you have seen in this presentation would be possible today. They would be absolutely forbidden. And because of that, and the dominance that they have within the religious area, you would not find it in conservative or reform books either, or items. And that's an incredible concept in my mind. It shows you that 300 years ago, in the ghetto of Frankfurt, when we think of Jews as isolated and cut off from their surroundings, they were more open to the general culture and environment that they lived in than our religious people today, at least within Judaism. That's it.
So I want to show you something. On this thing on the right, Germany 1744, the bottom left figure is almost exactly the statue of Moses in the Santa Maria della Catena church in Rome. And the two figures
Wonderful, wonderful. Let me write that down just a second.
And the two figures in the center, in the church, there's Moses in the center, and then the two figures next to him are Leah and Rachel, and they look almost exactly like those two center figures.
What's the church?
Santa Maria in Catena, Saint Mary in chains.
In
chains. Catena or chains.
Can you spell that for me? I'm not catching it.
Catena. Catena.
Catena. Okay, great. Yofi, thank you very much.
That's
this is
amazing.
A wonderful thing. I have never yet met and talked with an audience where I don't learn something. And that's the great thing about dialogue. It's
so
fantastic.
Bill,
yeah,
this was great. And I love the way you used context as opposed to just doing, as you said, the treasures of your collection, and putting everything in context was so enlightening. But speaking of enlightening, the image of Moses, which I'm sure Shari will agree with, shows those rays of light, which are a direct translation from something biblical,
right,
which gave the the Gentile world a way of saying that Jews have horns.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
there were several other pictures before, earlier, that had the same thing.
Yeah, and
The rays of light.
in the earliest images of Moses, you still find some without, but really by the 18th century they had completely adopted. Although if you look at the 1744 little prayer book that we had, they're very clearly rays. They're not horns as
Mhm.
as came to be interpreted. But yeah, that for sure. And there's there's other examples of that kind of thing, because we had no tradition of biblical. I mean, we had a tradition. You see the mosaics and synagogue floors both in Europe and in the Holy Land, and they even have pagan images. So it's not something that only developed later. But generally, in terms of figural art, we didn't see a lot within the Jewish tradition until quite late in medieval manuscripts, and that were very often done in Christian scriptoriums. So
Bill.
Yeah.
One of our speakers in a couple of weeks is Jody Mangus, who's been excavating in Israel and
Mhm.
discovered a synagogue. And as she was excavating the outer area, there was this richness of mosaic figures. And, you know, the figures were allowed then. When did this whole prescription against showing the human figure come into the book?
Well, I'm not sure that it ever did. It was a constant war, and of course that has to do with the whole philosophical interpretation of the second commandment as to what represents an idol image, which has often been interpreted to be a three-dimensional image, and the two-dimensional image is less. But even there are controversies going on between rabbis in the Middle Ages about synagogue decorations, of even floral and fauna decorations, not human figures, as to whether it's permissible or not. So it was a fight all along. I don't think that it ever reached an incredible prohibition totally, but it certainly was not prevalent. Between, if you see the medieval manuscripts up the Renaissance manuscripts, Hebrew manuscripts, they're filled with figures. So from that, but how many people saw illuminated Hebrew manuscripts? The very wealthy, maybe the clergy to some degree, but certainly the average person never saw it. So until printing came in, and in the middle of the 15th century, and then you began to get images appearing in printed books, and that continued and expanded. But today, I mean, you would never, what you see here, what you saw in that the title page on that little manuscript, and which Shari talked about, you wouldn't find that today. I mean, it wouldn't be done. Even that, which doesn't show nudity, which doesn't show anything, simply isn't done. And it's and that's a whole different story that goes back to the fight of religious Jews against the Enlightenment that came out of the 18th century and influenced a lot of Jews into the 19th. The reaction of religious Judaism against Hasidism and the rise of Hasidism during that same period, and its big expansion during the 19th century. And of course, finally with the Holocaust, where these communities were just wiped out. And in order to survive afterwards, I always liken it to the settlers who were going out to the West, the farmers in these wagon trains. And at night, they would circle around and sleep in the middle to keep themselves and to protect themselves from the Indians. And that same sort of thing happened with the ultra religious. They knew that they were in danger of disappearing, and they began to use the most extreme methods in order to separate themselves from the rest of society in the name of preservation. And it worked. They're growing today. They are, I mean, I'm not going to get into an argument as to how I feel philosophically about what they do, but they certainly keep a certain portion of Jewish life alive and vital in ways that a lot of us don't.
Bill, can we take down the presentation so we can do a gallery view? There we go. Now you can see everybody.
Oh, there
Bill,
you go.
when did Hasidim start? The Hasidic tribe, if you want. When did that begin?
It began in the middle of the 18th century. The founder, Baal Shem Tov, was born, I think, in 1726, and he died in like 1769 or 1770, and it went on from there. And it was a reaction also to many things that had happened, to the huge massacres of Khmelnytsky in Poland and the Ukraine, in the middle of the 17th century, which was like a Holocaust then in terms of European Jewry. So it also was a reaction partly to that, and partly, I think, to kind of an intellectualization of Judaism, to which the average Jewish guy, the butcher, the whoever it was, could not relate. And he needed a question of joy in prayer, not a question of intellectual approach to Judaism.
But couldn't that be when the modesty started?
Yeah, I would guess it probably was. I mean, I think that modesty was probably all a thing, but it wasn't the primary value that it has become today for the Jewish female. I mean, that's among the ultra Orthodox, that determines every single aspect of their lives, 24 hours a day. Their dress, their behavior, the way they cook, the way they relate to other people. It's absolutely amazing.
Them.
Oh,
Yeah.
Shoma.
Eddie.
Oh, go ahead, Shoma. You first.
Oh, sorry. I was fascinated. I don't know much about Jewish history in terms of art, so this was amazing to me. Thank you so much.
With great pleasure. I don't know much either, so be careful.
Yes, you do.
I just sent in a screenshot, a picture that might relate to the last slide you showed.
Uh-huh.
It was a picture of the Arabian Nights done in 1715 from David Foster. He had the same setup of the illustration that was in your last book. That last book, I don't know what it's called. It was next to your Traveler's Prayer. What was that book on? Because it was said something I couldn't read. What was that book about?
The print, not the manuscript.
No, what were the stories about? It had a
Traveler's Prayers.
No, it was the book right next to it. Was it a book of stories?
Yes. No, it's a prayer book. It's a woman's prayer book. These books were prepared for women, and they have women's prayers before they go to bed. The Traveler's Prayer.
Like a book of hours from medieval times.
Yeah.
Like the Duc de Berry.
They don't quite rise to that artistic level, but perhaps in principle, that's probably what's meant. Yes.
There was a very, very similar look. And then I had a question on the prayer book. Was it just me in the back of the Mary and Joseph? It looked like Don Quixote. One of the trees looked like a windmill, and there was almost like a figure, like a guy on a horse.
I hadn't noticed, but
that's great.
Yeah, that would
without
be
the laugh.
I mean,
exactly what it's like.
it is quite different than let's see.
It's such wonderful whimsy.
No, it's a tree.
It is?
Yeah.
Because I couldn't see it that clearly. I was like, what is that?
Yeah. No. I understand how it could be interpreted as a windmill. Absolutely. But it's a tree.
Okay. Thank
Interesting.
you.
Yeah.
So, when
Now Betty was next.
yeah, there were a couple of things. One was that the Simchat Torah flags,
Yeah.
the images of that kind of slaughter could have been seen in something like even a Rubens painting, or any of the slaughter of the innocents or the rape of the Sabine women. So those kinds of images were being done not only as the great paintings that we see in museums, but they were copied as etchings and
Yeah.
engravings, and became more widely available to the public. So that would have been seen.
Yeah. Just a
The other-
second.
the other
Wait. I can only write so fast. And
Oh.
no, that's
You know,
That's
The
terrific.
New Testament slaughter of the innocents, or the rape of the Sabines.
yeah. Absolutely.
But the question I wanted to ask was, when you, and again, I'm really interested in the contextual aspect of your whole talk. When you say that there was this acceptance of the cultural milieu in which these artists live, in which the Jewish community lived, could it also be that the artisans who were making these things were working for two different kinds of patrons and brought the imagery across? Because
It certainly it's possible.
I imagine the scribes were Jewish, but maybe not all the artists were.
Well, in many cases, the artists and the scribes were the same, and you can see that in the rather folkish elements that you have in the illustrations. So my general feeling, and I can't even say that I have a good contextual reason for thinking that, but I think it would have been that there were artisans. For instance, many bookbinders were Jewish, and so I'm sure that they had Christian clientele, because some of them were incredibly skilled. But as artistry, I kind of think and see that the level of the Jewish illustrations really is considerably less than what you see in the Christian world. You even see, for instance, in silver objects, if I've gone in, we once almost did an exhibition in Germany of church and synagogue objects by the same silversmiths in the 18th century. And there's no question that when a Jewish patron came to a Christian silversmith and ordered a pair of those Torah staves, on the top of the Torah staves, he gave the work to the newest apprentice who had just joined his shop. They're very rarely on the same level with fine church silver. Sometimes they are, but very rare. So I think that in general, my instinct tells me that would have happened with artisans, but not with artists.
Interesting.
Joseph?
William, that was such a wonderful talk. Your ability to do research is so fascinating. The path you take and the way you get your facts. Now, I'm an old friend of Stephen Little. Some of you may know. He had photographic memory. Do you have photographic memory?
Oh, I only wish. I must tell you that at least recently I have come to the conclusion, for instance, that the cells in my mind for names, there is
It's
a little
definitely
bag,
the cells in your mind.
and it developed a leak, and just everything is leaked out. It's just horrible.
Not
So
every.
no photographic memory at all. But I do.
No, wait, stop saying it. That's not, stop. Because you were saying I had this strange candelabra in my mind for years as I drove through the Ukraine. And I finally went to a city you can't pronounce the name, and there it was.
And there it was.
And it's like, so clearly, now if I have an idea that it really concerns me, it's fresh all the time. Like it never
Yeah.
goes away.
Yeah.
But you did it with the most, you really had to, you were finding incredible reverberations of form over time. And
Joseph, that was then.
this is the story, the history of your life. Okay. Wow, you were wonderful back in the day. Oh my God. But really beautiful. And to be able to notice those things and to bring them together really makes the culture start to resonate. It makes a resonating kind of way of looking at it. I was so impressed with it. And
Well, thank you very much.
and wonder how you record. And I have one, and you're also very scientific in that you would present something and I would want to say, and so what do you think that means, William? And you'd go on to the next thing. And so I'm just going to ask you one question.
Sure.
What do you think it meant that they started putting naked women on the religious books and the clerical books? Why do you think they did it? What was the point?
I just think that these people saw it in the Christian society around them, and they did. Now, I'm glad you raised that. You're
I've been
100% right, because in a couple of the books, the first books that were holy books, which have these things, those were not title pages carved for Jewish books. Those were reused, secondary use title pages from Christian books.
Right.
But the fact that they would use them
That's
doesn't
the
make any
question.
difference.
And was there anything, there was nothing clever in it? There was no other voice happening?
I don't think so, but Joseph, it certainly could be.
I don't know.
I want to go back to the person we were talking about, artists, and perhaps they're doing work for, as it happened in Amsterdam in the late 17th century. There were Portuguese and Spanish Jewish calligraphers who worked for everybody. They were the most, but that almost gets into artisanship. And what they were doing was like illustrations for documents and doing documents and certificates. They were incredible. Their work, both in Hebrew, and there was one guy who worked in like 7 different languages. It was absolutely amazing. So I'm sorry, that was necessary, because there were instances where they were definitely working for both elements of society.
So getting back into the discussion of why were there naked ladies?
Yeah.
I have a couple of thoughts about that. One is that the Adam and Eve story it would be a way of showing shame. It would be a prurient way of showing shame, but the idea that Adam and Eve, when they leave the garden, all of a sudden Eve is covering up. And this was
Right.
a really common trope in medieval German paintings,
Yes.
early Renaissance paintings. Like if you,
Sure.
I can't think of the names right now. It's early morning here. I'm in California.
Okay.
My brain isn't quite awake yet, even with 2 cups of chai.
And mine is shutting down. We're in Tel Aviv.
But the other thing is that, so it was a way of getting around the stigma and saying, well, before they left the garden, Eve was naked. So, okay, we can show that. But the other thing on that, I think I wrote down, I may be saying this wrong, the Yalkut Shimoni.
Yeah.
You said they were angels on the sides. Those were actually grotesqueries.
Okay.
And they were a way of indicating the mouth to hell in medieval painting.
Uh-huh.
And so these grotesqueries were the idea that there were these creatures that would have a woman's breasts and wings and claws of a griffon of some sort.
Wonderful.
And so
No, that's terrific.
the fact
However,
that they would then be used to decorate some sort of holy document is almost grotesque in itself.
yes, and I'm sure that they had no idea of that meaning for that. They were I'm positive they were simply copying
Exactly.
another title page of a Christian book that they had as a model.
Which
And they
is
just
why I
used
went
it.
back. My previous question is, were people picking up motifs that they didn't necessarily know what they meant?
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%, for sure.
Interesting.
Alan,
Uh,
Earl,
w-
please.
Well, Merle, go ahead.
No, go
Oh,
ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
So William, in your exhibits, do you also contextualize things the same wonderful way that you did now? I mean, do you tell these stories and show the comparisons? Because this is great. I mean, for every exhibit I've ever worked on, the entire idea that you just show something and leave it at that is just so inferior, to
Oh, yeah,
using it
no,
as a doorway to open things and deal with issues.
It's scandalous that exhibits used to be that way.
I know.
Exhibits of objects used to be putting them on a pedestal
Right.
as an art object and leaving it at that.
Right. And if you don't appreciate it, you're stupid.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
know, my father, of blessed memory, used to say his company used to have, it was a laundry and dry cleaning company, and they had standalone stores in different places to be more widely spread. And he used to say, when we go choose a store, we have 3 criteria that we're looking for: location, location, and location. And so I paraphrase that often when I talk, particularly to students. I say that when you're looking at these things, you have to have 3 criteria: context, context, and context. Because
Exactly.
without that, it has absolutely no meaning and relevance. And
It's shallow. It's just very shallow and basic when you could go so deep.
yeah. So back to the exhibitions. I have a particular view toward those. These are not exhibitions, or most of them, that I generate. These are museums and curators coming to me and asking me to lend items that fit in with the particular theme of the exhibition that they are doing. So, and I decided a long time ago, and I view myself as a supplier. It's their job to do the curating. If they ask me my opinion, I tell them. But I don't have the credentials, and I don't have the, I don't think it's right that I should interfere with that. So they tell me what the theme is. I go through my collection. I pick out those things that I think are relevant and the reasons. And I have writing and what I call an info page on every object that tells something. But these are not things that I curated.
They're missing an
other people.
opportunity. They're missing a very serious opportunity. We
No,
should talk.
they're smart people, believe me.
Merle?
Well, I also want to applaud this approach. I've learned so much today. It's been terrific. I have a question. I actually need a little clarification. Early on, you were talking about books that were written specifically for women, and they were, I believe you said, in Yiddish.
Yes,
And then you said, I believe, that Hebrew was reserved for men for the religious texts used in the synagogue.
correct.
But later in the presentation, I'm almost positive you showed a book for women that had Hebrew alphabet in it.
Absolutely. That, you're pointing out something that I really hadn't thought about, Merle, and that is that these little miniature books that were made from like 1720 through the end of the 18th century by these wealthy merchants for their wives were all in Hebrew. But I also have a feeling that they were, what can I compare it to? Okay, somebody gives you a magnificent limited edition book, and you put it on the shelf, and it's there as a wonderful gift, as a wonderful limited edition. And after you first got it, you never look at it again. And it sits there as a valuable gift that somebody gave to you.
It's more an objet than a book.
Yes, exactly.
But Bill, wasn't Yiddish written in Hebrew letters? What are we?
used the
what are-
Hebrew
Yeah, but it's a different, in printed Yiddish. It's a slightly different type. It's a special typeface. But yes, it's in Hebrew letters for sure. but they
Yiddish
could read it
words.
because they could sound it out from the letters. But Hebrew, they simply didn't learn. Now, certainly there were, of course, people who were more educated, and I hate generalities. And if I used any, saying never or always or any of those things, because nothing is a generality, and there's always exceptions to the rule in all these things. So yeah, the women could read that, and from the end of the 17th century through the 18th century, particular in southern Germany, where there was this huge area, and into Eastern Europe, there was a whole genre of Yiddish literature for women that's only recently started to be explored. It's really quite extraordinary. Literature, not just the biblical stories, and it's fantastic. And it was literally unknown. I don't. Does anybody? Okay, when Jewish text, something with Hebrew letters on it, is no longer useful, it cannot be just thrown away. It has to be buried. And in Jewish communities across Europe, in the synagogue, usually in the upper story, there was a hole in the floor, and any discarded text would be put into there. So that, and then they're supposedly supposed to be pulled out and buried, and it's a regular burial ceremony when a group of these things were buried. Now, in many cases, they just accumulated, like the famous Cairo Geniza, if any of you ever have heard of it. But in the beginning of the 1980s, it's very interesting. A guy, okay, I go back. Give me 5 minutes because it's an interesting story and aspect. In the late 19th century, as the industrial age really began to develop and the small, poor communities, people began to go to the cities to get work, many of the rural Jewish communities basically disappeared. And in many of these places, they did have small synagogues. So these synagogues, whereas it's forbidden in Jewish law to sell a cemetery, it's not forbidden to sell a synagogue. It's a structure. And so they were often sold. And in 1984, in a small town called Westfield in Germany, in Bavaria, a man bought one of these, which had been converted into a house, and he decided to do a renovation. And as he began pulling up the ceiling and changing it, he came across this huge trove of things written in Hebrew. Now, he had no idea what it was or what language it was, but he called somebody, either the priest in his village, and somebody came and said, that's Hebrew. So he called up, he was not too far from Munich. He called up the Jewish community in Munich and said, listen, I got this tremendous amount of material here written in Hebrew. It comes out of the ceiling of my house. Would you guys like it? And I hate to say this is typical, but they said to him, yeah, we'd love it. All you have to do is bring it to us. And of course, you know, he was as likely to do that as I'm going to continue speaking in Latin. So, and so he began to throw it away. There were 3 dumpsters full of material.
Oh, no.
One of them had already gone to the municipal dump. And somebody called a friend of mine, a professor from Dusseldorf, German history professor, who's also interested in Jewish history, and told him about this. And he got in his car and he went there 3.5 hours as fast as he could. And he got there while there were still 2 dumpsters there. And he pulled out material, which he took. The rest of it got thrown away, including, for instance, 50 pages from a beautiful illuminated medieval machzor, which is a festival prayer book, all sorts of incredible documentary material that goes on. And since then, about 150 of these have been discovered, because once the realization was there, people began to go out and look for former synagogues that had been converted into commercial buildings or into houses or whatever it was. And it's created a whole genre. And there they have found this Yiddish literature that was printed in Sulzbach and Fürth in southern Germany for women. And it was simply unknown before. It's really quite extraordinary. So anyway, that's the
It's sort
story,
of
but
the
how these things
Harlequin
come up.
romances.
Yeah, for sure.
Shari.
Shari.
You said that in the synagogue, you said on the upper floor, there was a hole that they put the books they didn't, into which they put the books they didn't want. I have a visual of women, because the women were upstairs and the men were downstairs, of women dropping these books down. You can take your rules and shove them.
Yeah, the actual place, if you think that most synagogues at that time had some kind of curved or rounded roof. And so if you went above that onto the flat floor of the upper story, the part where the curved came down, that created a space. And that space was often used for this geniza. For that, but I like that idea. If you don't mind, I'm going to quote you, Shari.
50 Shades of I don't care anymore.
Yes, Betty.
Penelope?
Penelope,
Penelope?
you're muted.
I'm wondering, I just unmuted myself. I'm wondering, this is fascinating. Thank you so much.
Oh, bless
I'm
you.
wondering the question Burl raised of the Yiddish books and then the travel book being in Hebrew. I'm wondering if this has anything to say about changing ideas of education of women, that you'd learn to read Yiddish because that was you should pardon the expression, lingua franca
Yeah.
of the day, but to learn Hebrew was something else again. It'd almost be like, girls learning to read English, but not
Yeah.
learning Latin.
Yes. No, for sure. There's
Was
much.
there a change in women's education at this point?
For sure. When the Enlightenment began to be a major force in Jewish life, of course, and you began to get that, particularly in Germany during the 19th century, where you began to get women's education. But before that, it was quite unusual, and in many cases, I think that they were almost forbidden to learn Hebrew. It was unnecessary. And, it's bad enough to go to a synagogue today and sit, if you don't read Hebrew, for hours and hours. And basically, I think that's what most women were condemned to in the synagogues earlier than that.
Just to clarify one more point, it's my understanding, let me go a different way. You showed us images that were from Morocco, from Persia, from places that were not Central Europe.
Yes.
It's my understanding that Yiddish was not a language that existed outside of Central Europe. Is that wrong?
Oh, no, it's 100% correct. But there were languages. There was a Judeo-Arabic and a Judeo-Greek that was like it was a parallel to Yiddish among the people in Europe, among the people in North Africa, for instance.
Well, Ladino
Ladina.
for the Sephardim.
Yeah. I realize you can't totally generalize because we're talking over centuries, but to the extent that we're in a country where the men are fluent in Hebrew and the women are not, in the home, would they speak the local language?
Sure, they would speak Yiddish together. They would speak Yiddish together.
So there, Bill, would there be three languages? Hebrew, Yiddish, and German, say?
Yeah, oh no,
or Italian,
absolutely.
French.
You know, we are so limited in languages, and people who came from Europe. First of all, you know, in the United States, you go 3,000 miles and you have one language. In Europe, there are places where you go 150 miles and you've already heard three languages. So it wasn't just a question of education, it was a question of necessity. And so they did. And for sure, the men had Hebrew, although it was not basically a spoken tongue at that time, but they could read and write it. And if they had to, they could speak a form of biblical Hebrew for communication. But absolutely, languages were, I mean, these people, you know, if we get two languages, we're very proud of ourselves. And those people were just amazing. And we're not talking about people who went to university. We're talking about the fishmonger and the garbage collector. I mean, their lives were involved with different languages.
Their lives were dependent on being able to communicate.
Absolutely, Merle, for sure. That's perfectly true.
And they didn't have the luxury of being so arrogant that they thought their language was the only one in the world.
Yeah, for sure.
Betty?
Yeah.
I have an unrelated question about something I read in the New York Times this morning.
I have a lot of unrelated answers, Betty, so I hope we come together here.
Well, I'm interested in your opinion because I was reading the article about Effie Aitam, if I'm saying his name correctly, being nominated to be the new director of Yad Vashem, and how completely disastrous that seems.
It's the most horrible idea that I can imagine. He's an absolute brute. He's a terrible man. It's just, it shows you how the whole world is becoming so partisan and political. And it's exactly the same way that Trump tried to put his people into every place that he possibly could. And Bibi is doing the same thing. They're brothers. They're not just cousins. And it's frightening. It's frightening that the thought could come up that a man like this would be put in charge of Yad Vashem.
I know, I nearly wept while I was reading it.
Oh, it's just
Background, please.
Oh,
Yad
the
Vashem.
brigadier-
Yad Vashem, of course, is our national Holocaust monument, and they do incredible research and outreach, and it's a place where people come for education and teachers all over the world, and it's a wonderful place, and it's one of the main visiting places in the world. And it's a pure place. It's not political. I mean, nothing is not political. It's political in the way that we present a certain view of the Holocaust, and we hope that we can make a lot of people feel guilty, or at least they should understand what can be, if nothing else. And this man is a brute who he was a general, and a very successful general in the army, but he's ordered his men to beat prisoners to death. He's a far right political nationalist and religious nationalist, which is the worst kind. It's just, Betty, I've also cried about it. It's just, it's inconceivable that the idea should even arise.
The idea that it's so counter to part of Yad Vashem's mission, not only being as a memorial to the Holocaust, but also as a teaching tool that it shouldn't happen again, and that we have to protect ourselves against racism of any sort.
Absolutely, tolerance, and it's
Acceptance.
Yeah, so that's the background, Barbara, and it's really horrendous.
It's an article in this morning's New York Times.
I read it also. It was. Yeah, it's worth reading. It's a pity. Yes.
Sherry, you can go first.
No, go ahead, Shoma.
I was just going to say, you mentioned the Cairo Geniza. I sent on a screenshot a Geniza from the Cambridge University. It had the Judeo-Persian, where they were learning Persian.
Right.
Right. Very, very fascinating languages.
Yeah. No, it's it was Judeo-Persian is a major language, and it goes back 1,000 years. It's not like Yiddish, which developed several hundred years after that. So that kind of vernacular is very, very necessary. Shari, were you?
We talked about Yiddish being Central European. My grandparents were from Russia, as I'm sure many were, and they spoke Yiddish. And
Yeah,
my
no, it's not just
grandmother,
Central European.
my grandmother was here
yeah.
for decades and never really learned English. But she had the Yiddish newspaper delivered every week,
Sure.
and she read the Yiddish newspaper.
Yeah, yeah. No, it was a language all across Europe, although there were different dialects. I mean,
I'm sure.
the Yiddish in Eastern Europe had a lot of Eastern European Slavic words in it, which you would not find in the Yiddish in Germany.
Sure.
So it had variations, as all of those languages did. Yeah.
Interesting. It's fascinating. I loved your talk. I loved the pictures. It was wonderful.
Bill, thank you. And I knew this would be spectacular. And thank you for giving. Oh, do I see Lisa?
Say hello.
How are you, dear lady?
I was sitting quietly in the corner here. I didn't want to disturb it.
Oh,
Enjoyed it too.
I miss you guys.
I miss you too. I can.
I love how all our hair is getting longer.
Right. Okay.
That's
Anyway,
interesting.
thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you
This was
for
joy.
all. And,
Thank you,
Thank you
Bill.
very
This
much.
was a treat. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That's
Take care.
wonderful.
well,
Would you have known something was missing if I had taken it from your apartment? It was so much.
yeah,
I'm not sure I would know with my gal boxes.
yeah. No, we don't. Again,
Bye-bye.
thank you all very much.
Love
Thank
you all.
you. Wow.
Have a wonderful week,
Stay well.
and well, let's
And
not
go
get
on.
into, we won't get into politics.
Good.
Okay.
Bye.
At least stay well.
We hope not. Alan, congratulations on your
Yeah,
daughter.
and stay
Oh,
healthy. Take
thank you.
care of yourselves. That's very important.
Too.
Yofi. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.